In the early hours of February 28, 2026, something happened that the world had spent decades fearing, debating, wargaming, and dreading in equal measure. The United States went to war with Iran, not through sanctions, not through covert cyber operations, not through proxy conflicts conducted with plausible deniability, directly, openly, and with a concentration of firepower that stunned even the most seasoned military analysts who had spent careers watching the Persian Gulf. At exactly 1:15 in the morning, U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, activated Operation Epic Fury, launching the most significant American military campaign in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Within the first 72 hours alone, U.S. and Israeli forces had struck over 1,700 targets across Iran. By the end of 10 days, that number had crossed 5,000. By the time a ceasefire was attempted in April, the damage done to Iran's military architecture was unlike anything the Islamic Republic had ever faced in its 47-year history. And within those first hours, Tehran itself was burning. The opening strikes were surgical in their targeting but overwhelming in their scale. CENTCOM announced the destruction of the IRGC Joint Headquarters, the IRGC Aerospace Forces Headquarters, integrated air defense networks that had taken Iran decades to construct, ballistic missile storage depots, command and control infrastructure, and radar systems that had served as the nervous system of Iran's entire military apparatus. Fox News, citing an official CENTCOM fact sheet released by the U.S. Department of Defense, reported that the asset list deployed against Iran was unlike anything deployed in modern American military history in a single, sustained operation. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, B-1 Lancers, B-52 Strato Fortresses, F-22 Raptors, F-35 stealth fighters, F-15 and F-16 strike packages, A-10 attack jets, EA-18G electronic warfare aircraft, E-2D Hawkeye airborne early warning planes, MQ-9 Reaper drones, nuclear-powered aircraft carrier strike groups, guided missile destroyers, and Lucas one-way attack UAVs, described by Defense Update as the first-ever combat deployment of that platform, modeled on Iran's own Shahed 136, now turned back against its strategic inspiration. Secretary of State Marco Rubio told reporters the mission's explicit goals were the destruction of their ballistic missile capabilities and their ability to manufacture them, as well as neutralizing, in his words, the threat posed by their Navy to global shipping. President Trump announced the strikes in an 8-minute video published on Truth Social at 2 a.m. Eastern Time. The War Powers notification went to Congress. The Gang of Eight was briefed. America was at war. But this story, and this conflict, did not begin on February 28, 2026. It has roots that stretch back many months, and to understand the full weight of what Iran is now facing, to understand how a military that spent 40 years preparing for this moment found itself in strategic retreat within weeks, you have to go back to a night in June 2025 that changed the trajectory of the entire Middle East. It is worth pausing here to understand exactly how Iran conceived of its military power before this war began, because that context is what makes the collapse so dramatic. Iran's defense doctrine was never designed around conventional military superiority. The Islamic Republic knew it could not match American firepower in a head-to-head exchange. Its doctrine was built on deterrence through asymmetric cost imposition. The strategy had 4 pillars: a nuclear program that would eventually give Iran the ultimate deterrent, a ballistic missile force that could threaten every American base and every allied capital in the Middle East without requiring a single Iranian fighter jet to leave the ground, a proxy network, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, the PMF in Iraq, that would make any American or Israeli military action against Iran simultaneously ignite fires across the entire region, and control of the Strait of Hormuz, the ability to threaten 25% of global seaborne oil trade, and thereby hold the entire world economy hostage to the cost of confronting Iran. All 4 of those pillars have now been struck. Some have been shattered. The speed at which the doctrine unraveled when tested against real American operational capability is one of the defining lessons of this conflict for military strategists around the world. On June 13, 2025, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a massive, coordinated air campaign against Iranian nuclear facilities, IRGC installations, and military leadership. Israel's F-35I Adir stealth fighters penetrated Iranian airspace, joined by F-15I and F-16I strike packages, conducting what the Israeli military described as 1,600 total sorties and the deployment of 4,000 munitions by March 3rd alone, according to Defense Update's documented overview of the operation. Israeli strikes targeted centrifuge facilities, weapons-relevant research infrastructure, IRGC headquarters, and the scientists and engineers who formed the human architecture of the program. But Israel faced an engineering problem that no conventional air force could solve: The Fordo uranium enrichment plant, buried 80 to 90 meters underground beneath limestone and reinforced concrete near the city of Qom, was beyond the penetrating capacity of Israel's heaviest bombs. So the United States answered the call. On June 22, 2025, President Donald Trump announced to the world that the U.S. had executed Operation Midnight Hammer, a strike of extraordinary precision and power against 3 of Iran's most critical nuclear sites: Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers dropped 14 GBU-57OB massive ordnance penetrator bombs, 30,000-pound bunker busters, the heaviest non-nuclear weapons in any nation's arsenal, directly onto the Fordo and Natanz facilities, while a U.S. submarine launched over 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles at the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center. The strikes lasted approximately 25 minutes. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told reporters in a Pentagon briefing the following day that initial battle damage assessments indicated all 3 sites had sustained, in his words, extremely severe damage and destruction. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, concluded the sites had suffered enormous damage. The Council on Foreign Relations, citing IAEA reports and satellite imagery analyzed by Maxar Technologies, confirmed that buildings at Isfahan were left torched and destroyed, and that the Fordo underground complex showed visible structural impact from the strikes. There was, of course, a fierce public dispute over the degree of damage. A preliminary classified U.S. intelligence assessment leaked to NBC News concluded the strikes had set Iran's nuclear program back by approximately 3 to 6 months, far short of Trump's claim of total obliteration. The White House called the assessment flat-out wrong. The Institute for Science and International Security, however, offered perhaps the most detailed independent analysis, concluding that the strikes had effectively destroyed Iran's centrifuge enrichment program, and that it will be a long time before Iran comes anywhere near the capability it had before the attack. That assessment also noted that residual enriched uranium stocks and uninstalled centrifuges posed a lingering threat, but the operational capacity, the spinning heart of the program, had been shattered. Whatever the final accounting, one thing was beyond dispute. Operation Midnight Hammer had ripped a gaping wound through Iran's nuclear military architecture 8 months before the full war began, ensuring that Iran would enter Operation Epic Fury already diminished, already degraded, already fighting with a broken right arm. When February 28, 2026 arrived, Iran was fighting a wounded version of itself. The pace of destruction in the opening days of Operation Epic Fury was relentless. CENTCOM's own publicly released fact sheets, Department of Defense documents available for independent verification, documented more than 1,000 targets struck in the first 24 hours. 1,700 by day 3. Over 5,000 by day 10. Among the confirmed destroyed or degraded sites, IRGC command centers, ballistic missile production facilities, drone storage sites, naval coastal surveillance installations, air defense radar networks, and the communications infrastructure through which Iran's military leaders coordinated operations. Fox News reported, citing U.S. officials, that at least 48 top Iranian leaders had been eliminated in the joint U.S.-Israeli operations during the opening phase. The Wikipedia-documented record of the conflict confirms the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself, the man who had held the Islamic Republic together for nearly 4 decades, killed in the opening strikes. That loss cannot be overstated. Khamenei's death created an immediate, cascading crisis of command authority inside the Iranian state. For 47 years, the Supreme Leader had been the single figure whose authority superseded every faction, every general, every elected official. His death in the opening hours of the war meant that the questions most urgent in wartime, who orders the retaliation, who authorizes negotiations, who can speak for the Iranian state with binding authority, were suddenly without clear answers. IRGC commanders, their communications already degraded by American electronic warfare operations that the Defense Update analysis confirmed were deliberately targeting Iranian sensors and systems, were operating in a rapidly fragmenting command environment while trying to respond to the most powerful military assault their country had ever faced. Iran fired back, and it did not fire back softly. Tehran activated Operation True Promise 4, the 4th and largest in a series of retaliatory strike packages Iran had prepared specifically for a direct U.S. confrontation. Ballistic missiles and attack drones were launched across multiple theaters simultaneously, at Kuwait, at Qatar, at Jordan, at Saudi Arabia, at the UAE, and at Israel. The Iranian strikes on Kuwait, documented by Wikipedia's conflict records and confirmed by Kuwaiti defense authorities, involved 97 ballistic missiles and 283 drones launched in waves toward American and Kuwaiti targets. The overwhelming majority were intercepted by Patriot and Thayad air defense batteries, but not all. 7 U.S. soldiers were killed in Kuwait. Dozens more were wounded. 3 F-15E fighter jets were lost in a tragic friendly fire incident during the chaos of the missile barrages. The Kuwaiti emir, Mishal al-Ahmad al-Jaber al-Saba, issued a public statement condemning what he called an unprovoked attack from a neighboring Muslim country, words that revealed the political fracture Iran's war was creating, even among nations it had nominally considered part of its regional ecosystem. In Saudi Arabia, Iran targeted Prince Sultan Air Base and the Ras Tanura oil refinery, the world's largest offshore oil loading facility, handling roughly 10% of global oil supply on its own. Saudi and American air defenses intercepted most of the inbound missiles and drones, but according to Wikipedia's documented conflict record, 2 U.S. soldiers were killed and 29 service members wounded in an Iranian missile strike on an American base in the kingdom. The U.S. embassy in Riyadh was struck by Iranian drones. Saudi Arabia reported significant infrastructure damage from falling debris even after intercepts. The Ras Tanura refinery briefly suspended operations before reopening on March 13th. In Qatar, the Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American military installation in the entire Middle East, home to thousands of U.S. personnel and serving as the forward command hub for CENTCOM operations, was targeted by Iranian missiles. In Jordan, Iranian drones and missiles were intercepted by Jordanian armed forces and U.S. forces operating jointly in the country, with one American MQ-9 Reaper destroyed. Against Israel, Iran launched the heaviest missile and drone barrage it had ever directed at the Jewish state. 28 Israelis were killed and over 4,000 wounded, despite one of the most layered and capable air defense systems on Earth, according to the conflict's casualty record as of mid-April 2026. And across all of those theaters, one strategic pattern repeated without exception. Iran could strike, Iran could cause pain, Iran could kill Americans and allies, but Iran could not stop the machine. CENTCOM did not pause. Night after night, wave after wave, American forces struck deeper and harder into Iranian territory. By March 13th, the scope of U.S. operations expanded dramatically when CENTCOM struck Kharg Island, the small strip of land in the northern Persian Gulf that handles between 90 and 95% of Iran's crude oil and petroleum exports, making it arguably the single most economically vital piece of real estate in the Islamic Republic's entire strategic landscape. The strikes hit over 90 military targets on the island, including naval mine storage facilities and missile bunkers. CENTCOM stated publicly that the island's oil infrastructure was deliberately left intact, a calculated signal that the United States was choosing restraint, that it held the power to destroy Iran's economy completely if it chose to, and that Tehran should take note of the restraint being shown. Tehran was watching, and Tehran was calculating how to survive. On April 8, 2026, after 40 days of uninterrupted air operations, a ceasefire framework was announced. Pakistan's government stepped in as mediator, producing what became known as the Islamabad Memorandum, a temporary agreement under which both sides would pause kinetic operations, while diplomatic channels explored a path forward. The Strait of Hormuz, which Iran had closed to all non-Iranian approved shipping on February 28th, when IRGC naval forces began transmitting warnings that no ship is allowed to pass the Strait of Hormuz, began to see limited movement again. More than 800 vessels had been stranded inside the Gulf during the worst of the closure. Global oil markets were in crisis. Reuters and CNN documented a fuel price spiral affecting nations from Europe to Asia. Brent crude would eventually touch $100 per barrel by late July 2026, its first close above that threshold since May of that year, underscoring the economic devastation that a contested Strait of Hormuz visits upon the entire global economy. But a ceasefire is not peace. And what Iran chose to do during the ceasefire is one of the most important and least widely reported aspects of this entire conflict. 2 senior IRGC officers spoke directly to the New York Times on August 1, 2026, confirming what the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute had long suspected. During the ceasefire window, senior IRGC Quds Force officers held virtual conference calls with Hezbollah commanders in Lebanon, Houthi commanders in Yemen, and Iraqi militia commanders affiliated with the Popular Mobilization Forces, coordinating plans to expand the conflict and increase the cost of U.S. military operations. The officers also confirmed that Quds Force advisors worked directly on the ground with these proxy groups throughout the ceasefire period. Iranian Artesh spokesperson, Brigadier General Mohammad Akraminia, made an even more candid admission on August 2nd, stating publicly that Iran had, in his own words, fully exploited the memorandum and ceasefire period to import new military equipment, repair and reconstruct damaged systems, and produce new weapons capabilities. This was not a regime preparing to make peace. This was a regime using the appearance of peace to prepare for the next round of war. The ceasefire collapsed in July 2026. Washington resumed strikes, citing Iranian attacks on commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz as the triggering violation. On July 10th, Trump stated publicly that talks with Iran would continue, but simultaneously declared the ceasefire null and void. The IRGC declared on July the 12th that the Strait of Hormuz was fully closed again after firing a warning shot at a vessel attempting to use an unauthorized route. That staggering figure does not include the compounding costs of destroyed military infrastructure that must be rebuilt, collapsed foreign investment driven out by the conflict, the economic disruption caused by the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of foreign nationals and diplomatic personnel documented in the 2026 Iran War's evacuation records, the loss of insurance and shipping access that had made Iran's limited oil trade viable, or the long-term consequences of a U-4. Saudi nuclear cooperation deal signed in July 2026, reported by Global Security and other outlets, that allows American-operated uranium enrichment on Saudi soil. That deal, if implemented as described, would fundamentally reshape the Middle East's nuclear architecture for a generation, creating a U. Anchored enrichment capability in Iran's immediate neighborhood that Riyadh could leverage as its own deterrent. Tehran's nuclear strategic ambitions, the work of 50 years, are being structurally encircled. Iran's internal political landscape reflects the strain of all of this. The Critical Threats Project's August 2nd, 2026 analysis noted that the IRGC faction led by IRGC Commander Major General Ahmad Vahidi appeared to be dominating regime decision-making at the time of writing, and that this hardline faction would likely reject any diplomatic arrangement, meaningfully reducing Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and other negotiators indicated limited willingness to compromise on Hormuz transit arrangements. But without IRGC sign-off, any agreement reached at the diplomatic table risks collapse the moment hardline commanders calculate that the military balance has shifted enough to warrant resuming pressure. CNN's August 5th coverage of ongoing negotiations noted that Iran was insisting all talks route exclusively through Oman, refusing to acknowledge direct communication with Washington, a posture that reflects the gap between what Iranian negotiators might accept and what the IRGC's leading faction is willing to authorize. This fracture, between the diplomatic track willing to deal and the military track unwilling to yield, is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of an institutional structure under the kind of stress that external pressure alone does not create. It is a stress born of repeated catastrophic losses, of watching the proxy deterrence architecture crumble under sustained American firepower, of navigating the absence of a supreme leader who held the factional balance together for nearly 4 decades, and of trying to preserve the Islamic Republic's legitimacy in the eyes of a domestic population that, by the time the conflict began, had already been through years of protests, economic collapse, and political repression. The Islamabad Memorandum was supposed to be the off-ramp. It collapsed. The June 18th memorandum, signed between Washington and Tehran, lasted less than 3 weeks in operational terms before strikes resumed. Trump's declaration from March 2026, published on Truth Social, where he wrote that there will be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender, set a bar that no Iranian government, hardline or otherwise, could publicly accept without political implosion. Whether that posture represents a genuine strategic objective or a negotiating theater is something only the most senior figures in the Trump administration can answer. But the gap between America's stated demand and Iran's survivable minimum has defined the conflict since its first hour. A note on sourcing and what remains unresolved. The facts in this analysis draw from official CENTCOM fact sheets published by the U.S. Department of Defense between March and July 2026, reporting by Fox News, CNN, The New York Times, Reuters, NBC News, and Sputnik, independent assessments by the Congressional Research Service, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Institute for Science and International Security, the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the Stanford Hoover Institution, open source military tracking at Global Military. Net and Military Spend, org, and Wikipedia's conflict documentation with sourced citations. The specific claim embedded in this video's title, that the United States is eliminating 1,000 Iranian troops per day, is not confirmed by any single independently verified source. Aggregate U.S. and Israeli claims of over 6,000 IRGC killed across 5+ months of conflict average to a significantly lower daily figure. Iran's own forensics data and independent human rights monitoring confirm losses in the thousands, but the specific day-by-day breakdown is not in the open source record. All casualty figures from both sides carry stated conflict incentives to distort, and viewers should weigh the range, not the extreme claims at either end. The broader reality, that Iran's military has sustained generational losses in this conflict, is beyond reasonable dispute. What comes next is the only question that matters now. The Strait of Hormuz remains the single most consequential pressure point of this war's next chapter. 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade passes through that narrow waterway. 20% of global liquefied natural gas moves through it. The IRGC insists it controls the strait and the terms of passage. CENTCOM insists it is facilitating free navigation and has helped move 900 commercial vessels since May. These two claims cannot coexist forever. Oil markets at $100 per barrel are not a sustainable condition for the global economy. Shipping firms that have suspended operations in the Strait cannot do so indefinitely. The 800 vessels stranded inside the Gulf during the April ceasefire represent a backlog that carries real economic consequences for real industries and real nations. Something in this conflict will eventually break. The question is what? As of August 13th, 2026, Iran has not surrendered. It has not collapsed. Its IRGC remains in the field, coordinating proxies, firing at American drones, and fighting for control of the world's most strategically vital waterway. But the Iran that existed on February 27th, 2026, with its nuclear program, its naval force, its missile infrastructure, its Ring of Fire proxy network at full strength, its supreme leader, and its command architecture intact, no longer exists. What remains is a diminished, embattled, internally fractured version of that state, operating without its most powerful deterrent, absorbing losses at a pace its military was not designed to sustain, and caught between hardline generals who will not yield, and negotiators who know the math is not in Tehran's favor. So we put the question to you. What do you believe comes next? Can a state absorb these levels of military, economic, and institutional damage and maintain political cohesion over time? Or does the sustained pressure eventually force a fundamental reckoning inside Tehran, one that no amount of IRGC rhetoric, no proxy coordination call, and no nuclear rebuilding project can ultimately prevent? And what does a post-conflict Middle East look like if Iran's deterrence architecture has genuinely collapsed? Who fills the vacuum, and what does that mean for the billions of people who live in and depend on that region's stability? These are the questions this conflict is asking of the world right now. And the answers will be written not in CENTCOM briefing rooms or in IRGC Quds Force command centers, but in the decisions made, or not made, in the weeks and months ahead. We want to hear your perspective. This is one of the defining stories of our era, and your analysis matters. Stay informed, stay critical of every claim from every side, and never stop asking who benefits from the version of events you're being told. Thanks for watching. Stay sharp. U.S. forces immediately resumed strikes across Iran. By July 20th, CENTCOM was confirming its 8th consecutive night of new strikes, targeting Iranian military command centers, missile launch sites, and air defense systems, and doing so alongside a parallel mission of facilitating commercial vessel transits through the strait itself. CENTCOM stated that since early May, its forces had helped facilitate the transit of approximately 900 commercial vessels and 450 million barrels of crude oil, projecting an image of America as the guarantor of free passage against Iranian obstruction. It is worth understanding what was happening simultaneously in the diplomatic corridors and in the economic data, because the military story of Operation Epic Fury is only half the campaign the United States was running. While CENTCOM aircraft were striking targets inside Iran every night, the U.S. Treasury Department and State Department were operating a parallel track of economic warfare. Fresh sanctions were imposed on Tehran in the days following the ceasefire collapse in July 2026. The U.S. imposed naval blockade of Iranian ports, which ran from April 13th through late May 2026, prevented ships at Iranian ports from leaving the Strait of Hormuz, not just restricting incoming trade, but trapping Iran's outgoing oil exports inside its own waters. The Department of Defense estimated this blockade alone cost Iran $4.8 billion in lost revenue by May 1st, 2026. For a country already operating under years of accumulated sanctions pressure, with a currency that had experienced historic inflation and an economy that had already lost much of its middle class to emigration over the previous decade, that revenue shock hit a state with no strategic financial reserve deep enough to absorb it without visible internal pain. On July 24th, 2026, the Global Security Daily Update documented a new dimension of the crisis that extended far beyond the battlefield. Iran rejected a U.S. ceasefire proposal carried to Tehran by Iraqi Prime Minister Ali al-Zaidi, a rejection that came even as the U.S. House of Representatives voted 214 to 208 to call for an end to the war. The Senate fell 49 to 47 short of advancing a binding resolution that would have curtailed the military campaign. These votes, close, contentious, falling just short of the threshold needed to constrain the executive, reflected a domestic American political debate that Iran was watching as closely as any CENTCOM briefing. If Washington's political will fractured before Tehran's military will collapsed, the entire strategic calculus would shift. That is precisely why the IRGC's August revelations about using the ceasefire to rebuild and expand coordination with proxies matter so much. It reveals a regime playing for time, betting that American domestic patience has a finite limit that can be outlasted. But the bet carries severe risks of its own. Now the title of this story demands direct and honest examination. The specific claim that the United States is eliminating 1,000 Iranian troops per day does not appear in any single verified, independently confirmed source. What the verified record does show is this. U.S. and Israeli governments have claimed in stated public assessments that over 6,000 IRGC military personnel have been killed since the war began. Iran's own forensics body confirmed by April 12th that 3,375 total war dead, military and civilian combined, had been formally identified. The human rights monitoring organization Henga documented 6,620 deaths among military personnel as of its April 8th report. The IDF published a mid-March estimate of between 3,000 and 6,000 killed among Iranian military forces, with a separate intelligence assessment, suggesting 6,000 or more IRGC dead and approximately 15,000 wounded. The independent casualty tracker at militaryspend.org, updated through July 2026, noted explicitly that both Iranian state and IDF figures carry strong incentive to distort, and flagged the entire range as disputed, running from approximately 1,800 at the low end of state media claims to over 7,000 at the high end of U.S. and Israeli estimates. Any single-day figure of 1,000 confirmed eliminations represents a number beyond what the sourced record can verify and should be understood in that context. The broader, undeniable reality that Iran has sustained historically catastrophic military losses across this conflict is documented across multiple credible named sources and is not in dispute. The equipment losses tell part of the story. The global military. Net open source losses tracker, updated through early August 2026, documented over 160 confirmed military equipment losses across the conflict, more than 130 aircraft destroyed and 31 naval vessels damaged or sunk. The MQ-9 Reaper, the USCS premier surveillance and strike drone, was itself the most frequently lost asset in the conflict, with 37 confirmed losses to Iranian interception and air defense, according to that tracker. Iran's Navy, meanwhile, lost 155 naval vessels destroyed or damaged, a figure, if accurate, representing a near-total collapse of the maritime capability the IRGC Navy had spent decades building as its primary tool for threatening Strait of Hormuz security. And beyond the hardware, Tehran has lost something harder to rebuild: strategic depth. For decades, the Islamic Republic of Iran constructed what geopolitical analysts consistently described as a ring of fire, a network of armed proxy organizations stretched across the Middle East, designed to make any direct U.S. or Israeli military confrontation prohibitively costly. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq. Collectively, these proxies represented Iran's deterrence in depth, the threat that even if Iran's conventional military was damaged, the costs would ripple outward across the entire region and make victory impossible to define. That doctrine has been tested against the reality of Operation Epic Fury, and the results have been sobering for Tehran. Hezbollah has sustained internal estimates of 400 or more fighters killed, with the IDF claiming figures as high as 1,700. Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces recorded 80 fighters killed and 270 wounded in U.S.-Israeli strikes targeting their positions, according to conflict tracking documentation. The Houthis faced continued American naval and air operations in parallel with the Iran campaign, as CENTCOM maintained pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. The ring of fire has not been extinguished, but it has been scorched, depleted, and strategically disrupted in ways that will take years to reconstruct. Meanwhile, the nuclear program that was the crown jewel of Iran's deterrence ambitions has been, at minimum, set back by years. The Institute for Science and International Security's detailed post-attack analysis confirmed the effective destruction of Iran's centrifuge enrichment program at its primary sites, while also noting that residual enriched uranium stocks in manufactured but uninstalled centrifuges pose a remaining proliferation concern. By spring 2026, satellite imagery and IAEA reporting confirmed Iran was actively working to rebuild, harden, and bury whatever remained of its nuclear infrastructure, accelerating underground construction near sites like Fordo, even as negotiations nominally continued. But the time required to restore operational nuclear capability, let alone approach weapons-relevant enrichment levels, had been pushed significantly further into the future. There is an economic dimension to Iran's retreat that numbers alone cannot fully capture. The U.S. Department of Defense estimated that Iran's own closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the move Tehran itself ordered, had cost Iran approximately $4.8 billion in lost oil revenue by May 1, 2026.